Is this microphone on? Yes, I think it is. First, I would like to express my thanks to my friends in Kaohsiung and from other parts of Taiwan for the invitation to join you. Again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to be able to participate in the discussions about the further development of the training centre, which is a wonderful initiative. I've been asked to say something about partnerships for development, and when I was thinking about how to go about this, it was possible to talk about partnerships and development in rather abstract terms. That's pretty boring for you and for me. So what I decided to do was to say something about my own experience of being involved in various development programs over the years. And it will be very selective. And what I hope to communicate is that development, and particularly sustainable development, is a complex and sometimes quite difficult process. And what I will try to do is to get from some of this experience some of the lessons that I think we have learned in working in trying to contribute to developing mental health systems, mental health programs in a variety of different places. And I'll be coming back towards the end to the leadership program that we established almost 20 years ago now. This is one of the particularly lovely groups from Vietnam that participated in this program, and I think Dr. Tan is in this one, right on that side there. So it's a real pleasure for me to also be with friends from the countries where we have worked and to have many of those friends here for this conference. So let me begin. This photograph was taken in Aceh in Indonesia very soon after the tsunami. And this is in a place called Loknya on the beach. And very soon after, that whole area was completely flattened. Little businesses began to spring up quite quickly. And what was, I think, most fascinating for me was the sign over this business. And it says, "Don't just come here to look, promise, then leave." And I think this is one of the most important lessons of being engaged in any kind of development program. Because when there is a natural disaster, money floods in, organisations flood in, people flood in, the money runs out, and then everybody is gone very quickly. And I think that's one of the most destructive things that can be done, because it raises hopes and expectations. It introduces some various new ways of maybe seeing and thinking about things, but nobody follows through. And I think and with this program, I think one of the most important issues is how can you sustain the program itself so that in the work that you do, you don't just come, look, promise, and then leave. So sustainability depends on sustained partnership. It depends on real commitment, and it depends on continuing joint work in order to do things. I'll talk about some things that have been quite successful in what we have been involved in. In none of these things that I will describe were we fully responsible for anything. We always worked with many other partners. And so it will be a discussion of these things, not as somebody who was responsible for these programs, but as somebody who has been a participant in these programs. And there have been some failures, and I will mention something about the failures, and I think some of the reasons that I think some areas have failed. I'll say a bit about leadership, because I think it's central to every discussion about development, and I will suggest something for your consideration in terms of some of the content of the Trainee Centres program that you may want to discuss. I'll give you some examples from Southeastern Europe from the early 1990s actually, following the Yugoslav wars. Some comments about our experiences in post-tsunami Aceh and also post-tsunami Sri Lanka. Some of the work that we have done with friends over time in Vietnam, and some comments about the different kinds of development objectives, very different contexts in which this work was done, and in terms of, again, planning, executing development programs, context is everything. That unless you have a detailed and sympathetic and understanding kind of familiarity with the context, then very little is possible. Timing, when things happen, is important, the sort of groups that have been involved and so on. So let me start with Southeast Asia. Some of you may be aware, many of you are too young in this room to know very much about this, but in the early 1990s, the state of Yugoslavia fell apart. And there were a series of wars that started in about 1991, 1992, and they went on until the early 2000s. And they were particularly brutal conflicts. Following the end of this first phase of these wars, the European Commission decided that it had to do something in order to restore stability in the southeastern European region and to promote contact again between the previously warring parties and to contribute to reconstruction and economic development. And one of the surprising things about this European Commission project was that one of the conditions that they applied for countries to participate in this economic and social development was that they had to build community mental health systems. It was a remarkable thing. It had never been seen before where community mental health was part of the condition for major funding for massive economic and other programs. So we were involved with colleagues from universities in Canada, in the United States, in Belgium, in a number of other countries, and a range of other organisations in working with these 8 countries over a number of years. The former Yugoslav states, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia, and also some of the surrounding former Soviet bloc countries. So we worked there for quite some time, and one of the requirements was that the mental health systems in those countries, insofar as they existed, were the old Soviet model mental health systems, essentially mental hospitals, nothing else. And so the task for this development program was to develop mental health legislation, national mental health policy, and to develop a number of pilot community mental health centres that would demonstrate how that mental health services could be delivered in community settings. This program went on for quite a number of years. We met in every one of these countries, including Moldova, which is right on between Romania and the Ukraine. And the surprising thing was that the first review of this Stability Pact program where all of the economic development projects, massive economic development projects, social development and a range of other things, when they reviewed these programs, what they found was that the mental health program was the most successful of all of these projects. Because the people who we were working with in government in those countries understood that given the experience that they had been to, that the mental health of the population was a centrally important issue. And so they actually committed to doing something about building effective mental health systems. They actually went on and developed mental health legislation. They did develop mental health policy. They engaged people in the community to help them to design the community mental health projects. So that's an example of a project that was very large scale, multiple partners, as I've said, from different countries, with sufficient funding for the program from the European Commission grants. And I will keep coming back to this issue of sufficient funding for development, because I may as well say now that without sustained funding for development, development will not happen. It will not happen. You can have all of the passion and all of the expertise collected together, but without the money in order to properly administer the project, proper governance of the project to make sure that it happens, and to actually fund the kind of new ways of doing things, it will simply not happen. So, a number of publications from this, a fairly successful program, and if you look now, 15 years later, at mental health in not all of these countries, the other thing to say is that the extent of development was variable across the different countries. But Slovenia, Croatia have very, I would say, excellent mental health programs now that's been developed in Macedonia. Serbia is not bad, and so on. So, a successful program. There were multiple collaborating institutions. Most important in these collaborations were the ministries of health in the countries in which the programs were being run. WHO was very centrally involved, WHO Office for Europe, mental health leaders within the countries, universities and consultants, and so on and so on. It was a successful program of development, and one of the markers of success of a development program is that when the development project finishes, development continues. Right? It doesn't stall. You know, it doesn't say, okay, well now, you know, the consultants, the experts, the money is gone now, we'll go back to doing things the way we were doing them. So it continues. Some of the reasons for success, I think, was that there were very clear and agreed objectives. It was a collaboration across 8 countries, actually, that were part of the projects, but also WHO Europe. Regular meetings over several years in each country by the main project groups. Effective governance and administration of the program with sufficient funding for this kind of administration and governance, and high-level expertise in a number of the groups that were the collaborators. But most important in the success was that the Stability Pact, that is the agreement, the European Commission agreement to fund other programs, was contingent on countries actually doing this well. It was a requirement that they participate and that they actually do it well. So that was a few early lessons from work in early Europe. I want to say a little bit about some of the work that we've been involved in these 3 countries, in Vietnam, Indonesia and Sri Lanka. As everybody knows, a massive tsunami at the end of 2004, 160,000 dead in one day in Aceh, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, massive disruption of everything to do, particularly in the coastal areas, But because the capital of the province, Banda Aceh, was on the coast and was very severely affected, the whole of the province was affected. That happened in the context of a long-running conflict that was between Achenese separatist groups, GAM, and the Indonesian government. So what happened was that within a few days, the government of Indonesia contacted WHO and asked for assistance in developing a mental health plan as part of the process of recovery. That plan was written from mid-January until late January, and by the end of January, the recommendations that were made as part of this mental health plan for Aceh were adopted by the Indonesian Ministry of Health as the mental health plan for Aceh. So from the beginning, there was clarity about what was to be done in terms of mental health. And in the first few years after this program started, and again, there were very many different collaborators in this program. I think one of the most important elements in the success of what happened in Aceh over those years was the absolute commitment of the National Ministry of Health, despite the conflict that had been going on for a long time, to actively contribute to recovery and reconstruction, and specifically to mental health development in Aceh. At the time of the tsunami, pretty much all there was in Aceh was the mental hospital in Banda Aceh, in pretty bad shape. The conditions were very poor, I would say, like in many other places in the region. But the commitment from the beginning was to build a community-focused mental health system in this province. And over the next few years, very many general practitioners, primary care doctors were trained. There were tens of thousands of community volunteers that contributed to the mental health program. Some very innovative community mental health nurse programs were developed by the University of Indonesia. And those community mental health nurses became one of the mainstays of the development of this program in Aceh. So within the first few years, reasonably comprehensive community-based mental health services were available. This community mental health nurse program was built up very quickly. As I've already mentioned, there were a very large number of mental health volunteers who contributed. This is part of a program in Indonesia, which is the Health Alert Village. In this case, the Mental Health Alert Village, where in the village there would be a number of volunteers. The head of the village would commit to supporting people with mental illness and so on and so on. So there was a very active destigmatization program as well. And within a small number of years, many of the district hospitals established acute inpatient units to take the pressure off the main hospital in Banda Aceh, but also to provide acute care for people with severe mental disorder close to home. So again, this I would say was a very successful example of post-disaster and post-conflict development. And some of the same reasons that applied to the European example apply here. The involvement of WHO and the provision of technical expertise, the involvement of a variety of consultants from different places with particular sets of skills that could contribute to the program, the absolute commitment of the National Ministry of Health to develop this program, and at least in Aceh in the first few years there was no shortage of money because money flowed in from everywhere around the world following the tsunami. Very unusual in post-disaster settings. And I think in about the second or third year after the beginning of this program, I recall that a national meeting was held in Banda Aceh for directors of mental health services from all of the provinces in Indonesia to come and have a look at how community mental health programs can be developed. And this was a mark of recognition from other parts of the country that what had been developed in Aceh was worth looking at, worth considering, maybe incorporating some of the principles in other provinces in the country. So I would say that that was a successful program of development. Some of the outcomes I've already mentioned: community-based mental health services, the community mental health nurse program. Some of the reasons I've already said: adoption very quickly by the Ministry of Health of the WHO recommendation, substantial funding, both internal and external funding for development, very strong support from the Ministry of Health by successive directors. Dr. Yulizar first, Dr. Pandu Setiawan was an absolute champion for this program. So many people were supportive of this program. And there was a very rapidly reached and wide consensus about what the needs of the population were, what were the priority areas to focus on, not to try to do everything at once, and which direction the development program should take. One of the things to say about development in post-disaster circumstances is that what often happens, and particularly if it's a massive disaster, is that everything is disrupted. Everything is thrown up in the air. Things come down where they may. And it's actually a very good time to introduce new ways of thinking, new ways of organising, new ways of doing work, because people are open at that time. If you go into a well-established mental health system and try to change it, which we've been trying to do in Australia for many years, then you run into all sorts of interests, centres of power, people who have different opinions about what ought to be done. Everybody is entrenched and it's very difficult to shift. So these times of disruption are actually good opportunities for introducing new ways of thinking. One of the outcomes, I think, of the work in Aceh was the recognition of the extent to which people with severe mental disorders suffer many forms of neglect and various human rights abuses. This is the governor of Aceh, who was a former GAM fighter, the first governor, who escaped from the prison because the prison was destroyed, eventually became governor, then later on was charged with corruption and other things. But so, you know, a very colourful life. But he was a very strong supporter of this human rights program in Aceh. And so in 2009, Aceh was the first place in Indonesia and the first government anywhere in the world that I know that acknowledged that this form of restraint of people with mental illness in the community occurred. And this is a practice which can be found pretty much all around the world. I know that Dr. Tan has had an interest in this issue in Vietnam, China, in Thailand in the past, particularly in rural areas, pretty much all around the world, including all over Africa. But what was important was that the provincial government announced a program that said, this is not acceptable and we will eliminate this practice from the province. Very, very significant step in my view. This sign here is on the old Ministry of Health building. Indonesia Bebas Pasung, that's Indonesia free from restraint. In 2010, a year after that provincial program in Aceh, the Minister of Health in Indonesia, who was a magnificent person, established a national program to eliminate this form of human rights abuse. By 2016-17, I don't know what the number is now, but most provinces in Indonesia have got a provincial program. And I know that Dr. Dia was very active in this when she was at the Department of Mental Health in Indonesia. 2011, Indonesia ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The mental health law was enacted, but the regulations are still not there. Is that correct? Yes. Presidential decree in 2015. So you can see it's a kind of a cascade of instruments for human rights protection for people with mental illness that has happened over the past 10 years or so, which is, I think, incredibly impressive. There's a lot of work to be done, but work is being done in order to better protect the interests of the rights of people with mental illness. Sri Lanka in many ways was similar to Aceh, where the number of deaths was smaller than in Aceh, but very, very large still. The tsunami swept all around from the east coast, devastated the east coast, and went right around up to the west coast. And some of the worst affected areas were in the southern province here, which was also the poorest province in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was also involved in a separatist conflict that had been going for 20 or 30 years, active conflict with the Tamil Tigers. So in some ways, Aceh and Sri Lanka were very, very similar. We were asked by World Vision, which was providing a lot of post-tsunami funding for reconstruction in Sri Lanka and WHO, to develop a mental health for the South, for the Southern Province project. And then we worked on this for a number of years. We did some rather similar things to the kinds of things that were being done at pretty much the same time in Aceh. And it has to be said that the outcomes were very positive. Very similar situation where community mental health programs, again, there was training of doctors, there was training of nurses, although not as clear as the program in Aceh, a lot of volunteers, and again, opening of acute units in district general hospitals rather than the main mental hospitals, which were all in Colombo and very inaccessible to people from the provinces. Some years after that work in Sri Lanka, we were asked then because Sri Lanka promulgated its first mental health policy in 2005. It was a 10-year policy. We were asked in 2014 to assist the Ministry of Health, the Department of Mental Health, with the revision of the policy from 2015 to 2025. We did that. We worked with lots of different people, had lots of different stakeholder meetings. We brought key experts to Melbourne to look at mental health programs in Melbourne. We had a range of workshops, and in 2015, we had a policy with which everybody agreed. That is, everybody that had been involved in the process, a revised mental health policy. But then it got stuck. Right? That draft policy is still in the Ministry of Health. It still hasn't been formally accepted, and certainly implementation hasn't commenced. The reasons for this failure of adoption and implementation are not very clear to me, because it was the ministry that asked for this to be done. They were involved at every step of the process, but there were internal divisions and conflicts and between psychiatrists and the Ministry of Health and various other things. In the end, there is still no revised mental health policy in Sri Lanka. So this is an example of failure of development where the development part is actually very successful, but the adoption of the products of that process gets stuck essentially for political reasons. And sometimes those political reasons are impossible for somebody who is outside the system to understand. Even people who were part of this process from within the country, I think were unable to give adequate were unable at least to adequately explain what happened. We've been involved in a variety of ways in Vietnam for a very long time, and we have lots of friends there. Lots of people have visited us in Melbourne. I'd like to give just a couple of examples of projects in Vietnam. And one is with the Ministry of Social Affairs and the other is with the Ministry of Health. The first was being invited by the Ministry of Labour, Invalids and Social Affairs, MOLISA as it's known, to review their residential social protection system for people with chronic mental disorders. Vietnam had a network of about 17 or 18 centres across the country, each of them with many hundreds of beds, none of them with any treatment resources, none of them with any any kind of rehabilitation program. They were essentially warehouses for people with chronic mental illness and also people with chronic neurological disorders. So I looked at this system, presented a set of recommendations to the Vice Minister responsible for social affairs, the mental health component of social affairs. And to my astonishment, over the next year or two, every recommendation in that report was fully implemented. The ministry put a proposal to the Prime Minister to completely renovate and reform their social protection system for people with mental illness. Massive central government funds were made available for this purpose. It's called the 1215 program because it's Prime Ministerial Decision 1215 in 2011, a 10-year program which has very substantially reformed the social protection system, including training of very large numbers of community social workers to work with primary health centres and so on. So this is an example, I think, of a very successful program. We are now involved in working with MOLISA in their development of their proposal for the next 10 years of this program of reform from 2021 until 2030. And so that will build on the achievements that have been, that have been achieved by the program. It will work out what have been the problems in those areas that have not been so successful. It will reprioritise, because 10 years on, the whole system in Vietnam is very different to what it was 10 years ago. The economy is different to what it was 10 years ago, and the priorities are quite different. There's a major reform going on in terms of health in Vietnam. The other example is the development of the National Mental Health Strategy for Vietnam. There had not been a national single mental health strategy before, and Dr. Tan knows very much about this because he was very, very involved in all of the various meetings that we had in many different parts of the country. So we were asked to prepare a national mental health strategy. I think it was in 2013. We worked on this as a group over a period of about 18 months or 2 years. We had very many meetings in Hanoi. We had consultation meetings in all different parts of Vietnam. By the end of that process, like the example from Sri Lanka, we had a national mental health strategy that the key people in the Ministry of Health appeared to be very happy with. And certainly all of those who had been involved had achieved consensus on the structure and content of the national strategy. One of the things that we recommended was that the strategy should be that there should be a national mental health coordinating committee above Ministry of Health to be chaired either by the Deputy Prime Minister or the Prime Minister in order to link health with social affairs, education and so on. In the end, what happened was exactly the same as what happened in Sri Lanka. This strategy was never adopted. It's still a draft. There has been no further activity on actually developing a mental health strategy, and whether anything will be done or not is, to me, entirely unclear. And the reasons for this are, like the example from Sri Lanka, not very clear to me. Maybe Dr. Tan can explain them. But the reasons are very obscure, and they are primarily political reasons that we have no influence over. So some of the lessons in all of these different types of programs, the first is that in all of the programs, the most crucial element is leadership. That unless there is effective leadership, and by leadership I don't mean one person at the top directing what happens, I mean effective distributed leadership at all different levels of the program. Unless there is effective leadership, very little happens. Effective system-level change always involves government. If we are talking about programs that are going to change the way things are done in a country, changing the way the mental health system is organised and delivered, then government always has to be involved. You hear many psychiatrists and other professionals saying, "I don't want to get involved with government, that's not my business." But I think if we're talking about reform and development, full two-way respectful involvement with government decision makers is absolutely critical. One of the things that I wanted to say is that the term partnerships is used, in my opinion, rather too loosely. I think if we're going to talk about partnership, we should be talking about partnership in its proper sense, legal sense. And that means that the partners are both jointly responsible and liable, and they are jointly deriving the benefits from whatever the enterprise is. I think rather than partnership, very often what we are talking about is collaboration or cooperation or coordination. And so I think when we're talking about building partnerships, I think we need to be very clear about what we're talking about. There are lots of different ways to working together. Networking, cooperation, coordination, collaboration. Partnership is like this. Partnership is like being married, right? It's like being married. Jointly responsible, and the kind of work we're talking about here is not partnership, it's collaboration, yeah? So I think we should probably use the kind of, it's easier to actually develop the relationships if we're clear about what kind of relationship we are developing. And to be clear about that, I think we should be talking in clear terms about what kind of relationship. So, networking, no risk. You say, oh yeah, we can share information and all that kind of stuff. We can join the Facebook group. We can network and tell each other what's going on. That doesn't involve any commitment or risk. We move on a bit further to cooperation. Still very low risk, low investment, low commitment, no real change required in the people who are cooperating. If the cooperation is not working well, you just walk away. There's no risk. Coordination, again, is very straightforward. It can be a bit more formal, it can be longer term. It can mean that I change a bit what I'm doing in order to fit in with what you're doing, you do the same, okay? Collaboration, durable relationship, can involve new structures like the training program that's been established here. It certainly involves comprehensive planning. It does require commitment of effort and resources, and there can be pooled or shared resources. But this is still collaboration. Partnership, formal agreements, not just memorandum of understanding, but also formal agreements, shared vision and goals, interdependence, detailed planning, and joint management of resources. Right? So pooling of funds and joint decision-making about resources. This is a partnership. So what we are talking about, I think, more than partnerships, is that we're talking about collaboration. Our conviction that leadership is the core issue in development led us to establish this program. Can somebody tell me, I'm probably already over time. How much time do I have left? How many minutes? 10 minutes? Okay. Thank you. Because of the experience that I briefly mentioned, we established this leadership program in 2001. It was a joint program between our group and the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard. We established it in 2001. A number of people in the room have been participants in this program and remain our very good friends. There are now hundreds of alumni in many countries, mostly in Asia, and many people who have been part of this program are in key decision-making positions in those countries. Not long after we established the program, we used it as a basis for establishing the first master's program in international mental health. So that was, I think, in 2003. One of the most satisfying things about establishing that program is that it led to the establishment of very similar programs that were derived from it in a number of places. This is a program that's run in Indonesia somewhat intermittently. It would be great to see it run regularly every year. This is a program that we helped to establish in Goa, in India, run by Vikram Patel when he was still at the Sangath Centre. This is a program that we again helped to establish in Ibadan in Nigeria with Oya Goreje, who's a key African leader in psychiatry, and this was for the West African Anglophone countries. So the participants were from those countries. All of these programs have continued to operate on an annual basis, and all of them have trained very large numbers of people. There have also been programs in a program in Cairo for the Eastern Mediterranean region of WHO and so on. So one of the things that suggested to us that the kind of model that we had developed seemed to be worth looking at was that it's been emulated in a number of different places and is running very successfully. This was one of the programs where we had two countries involved, Vietnam and Sri Lanka. And getting that kind of discussion across the two countries was a remarkably useful process. So let me say a few things about what I think are essentials in terms of development, partnerships for development or collaborations. One is that there needs to be commonality of purpose, the principles that underpin the program, the objectives and the kind of problems that the program is intended to deal with. Relationships are built over time. And I think relationships that are built with trust and, dare I say, just as important as trust is affection, that is that you actually really like the people that you're working with, is absolutely critical. It's worth thinking about big objectives. Right? If you're going to put the time and effort into developing the kind of program that you've developed here, it should focus on things that are really important, really important. And in the area of mental health, there is no shortage of things that need attention. There needs to be effective and transparent governance and decision making. People need to know how decisions are made. They need to know that the decisions are made in a fair and equitable way. They need to know that if they're supporting it financially, they need to know that the money is being used wisely and well, and so on. And the most important thing is that it's absolutely essential to maintain these things, to have some sustained funding arrangement. One of the problems with our program is that it was funded year by year with grants after the first 5 or 6 years, and that makes it difficult to continue. Now, one of the things that I wanted to suggest for your consideration was that you may want to think about a particular short course program, because our experience is that these programs, and your experience is the same through the program here, that it builds mutual understanding and collaboration. It can develop ongoing collaborative work and a range of other things. Now, in my view, the biggest challenge for mental health globally now, and this is not just in low and middle income countries, this is everywhere, is how mental health can contribute to the Sustainable Development Agenda. It will be the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals that will be driving governments everywhere. The sort of priorities that will be high priorities for governments are those that will help them to meet their Sustainable Development Goals, because governments will have to report on how they're doing on each of these goals. As those of you who are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, there are 16 goals right across economic development, climate change, the biodiversity both on land and sea, and education, gender equality, a whole range of different goals. SDG 3, the third Sustainable Development Goal, is health. And part of the health goal is mental health. But in the health goal, there is not enough of mental health in it. It has only a few areas that are mentioned. And in my view, one of the things that we need to do in mental health is to demonstrate how attention to mental health is absolutely critical for achieving many of the other Sustainable Development Goals. The achievement of the other Sustainable Development Goals is also very good for mental health. So the work on gender equality is terrific for mental health. The work on education is good for mental health, and so on. So one of the programs that I think I would welcome a discussion with you about is whether you might develop a training program that specifically focuses on mental health and sustainable development. Because not enough of our mental health professional colleagues are aware of the importance of the Sustainable Development Agenda specifically to mental health. And so that's something that I raise for your consideration. Thank you.